So we're so excited to have you all here for our second annual. We made it a year to the second annual Speculative Education Colloquium. Thank you so much for joining us. We love seeing everybody in the chat. We also love seeing the conversation that goes on social media. So if you use the social media, feel free to use the hashtag #SpeculativeEd on social media just to talk about what you are seeing and what you're enjoying and what you'd like to hear more about. We have a fun-filled day for you today, and we're so lucky to be joined by the inimitable, amazing Dr. Marcelle Haddix, who we will introduce in just a few minutes. We just wanted to kind of recap like where we are, where we've been, and where we hope to be going, and why we're doing this conference again, and the good parts about that and the troubling parts about that.
Yeah. We know it's a Saturday, and so we've tried to scale this back a little bit from last year's event was a 2-day kind of half-day endeavor each day. And if you're at all feeling maybe how I feel, you are webinared out after a year of kind of sheltering in place and all of these events. We're trying to figure out how can we make the most of our time today. So thanks for joining us on a Saturday.
Mm-hmm. And you know that we love to give opportunities to, even though we're in a webinar format right now because of the size of the group, we are going to be offering opportunities for us all to interact. And we're trying to put together, again, we're just putting this together kind of with the resources that we have at our disposal. So lots of Google Docs. So we have a Google Doc here, and we'll put the links into the chat. The first Google Doc is a read-only doc, but it shows you our agenda for the day, and it shows you the breakout rooms for the small group conversations that we'll be doing a little later today after Dr. Haddix's talk. So take a look at that document, keep it open because you'll need it later on. And then we have a second document, which is more of a sandbox sharing space, and that is an open doc. So if you are the kind of person that likes to doodle, if you are the kind of person that wants to share resources with the group, if you want to share your name and email, last year we had folks that were here in this Zoom that created book groups. The conversation is going to go on past this day, and we've got some exciting updates pretty soon about the future of the colloquium and ways that we can keep this work going. So put these 2 Google Docs onto your browser and continue to use the chat throughout. And one more quick note, for those that need closed captioning, if you go to the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should see a little button that says closed caption. If you click on that little arrow next to the closed caption button, you'll see the settings, and we are lucky to have real-time captioning for today's event. Thank you to the Stanford office of, what is it, Ontario? What office is it?
Accessibility, yeah.
Awesome, thank you. Is that it? Am I forgetting any logistics, Ontario?
I think if there are other logistics, folks, let us know in the chat if there's other stuff that we need to cover for logistics. We'll keep putting these links. I think I've private messaged it to people on accident, but we'll keep putting in the links to the sandbox space and the read-only agenda for information as well.
Awesome. And very quickly, we wanted to start off. We're going to talk in a moment about how we're thinking about the idea of the speculative, but we think it's important to start off today with an acknowledgement of the land that both Ontario and I and all of us are coming from all over the country and possibly beyond for this event, because again, the idea of the speculative is that the social arrangements that we find ourselves in right now are not all that ever was, and they are not all that ever will be. And so we think it's important to acknowledge where we come from to this work, and to remember that the frameworks that we've been socialized into are not the only frameworks that are available. So we need to push past those, and this is one way of doing that. So I just want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from what is, I'm an uninvited guest and settler on the land of the Lenape people in what is currently Brooklyn, New York. Ontario?
And I'm coming on from the land of the Ohlone and Ramaytush people. And I do want to recognize, this is the kind of picture in the middle here. Zoom is hosted through Amazon Web Services. And so the servers that are allowing all of us to be in conversation today and in the breakouts after this are also happening on land that is not ours as we think about having these conversations. And so as we think about the ecological and the sociological impacts of what it means to have been sheltering in place and being able to come together in these times, right, when we talk about the cloud is a place, and it's a place that we're not invited upon. So I just want to kind of recognize that as an important connection as we think about land acknowledgements right now.
And we encourage you, thank you for everyone who's putting their own acknowledgements in the chat. We'd love to know all the spaces that we're joining from today.
Yeah. Uh, I think it feels striking to me that when we did the speculative ed webinar last year, George Floyd was still with us. And a year later, we are continuing to live the trauma of his murder through a live stream trial that's ongoing right now. And so if we think about not just George Floyd, but the more than 1,100 people that were killed by the police last year, just want to recognize the ways that we have a lot of weight that us as educators, as educational researchers, need to maintain in terms of the work that we're doing. There's a couple other kinds of acknowledgements where I feel particularly frustrated about. I think the optimism maybe that Nicole and I were carrying into the Speculative Ed Colloquium a year ago. I feel, if I'm being honest, I'm feeling a little deflated about where we are right now. At this time last year, I think I was enthusiastically singing the praise of Arundhati Roy's idea of the pandemic as a portal, and this idea of we're going to be transformative. And here on the other end, possibly of this portal, it looks a whole lot like what it looked like in 2020 and 2019. And even if we may not have Trump in office, right? But I don't think things are a whole lot better, right? So this isn't about particular figureheads. And in fact, while we speak of the speculative, and Nicole's going to continue getting into this in a second, we speak of the speculative and the possibilities of imagining radical imagination. I do want to recognize that the January 6th insurrection that happened in the Capitol was a kind of enacted radical imagination. It was of the far right, and it was driven by white supremacy. But this is the work that when we think of dreaming and of engagement, these aren't purely tools of the left, right? These are tools that are used and are weaponized. And so this is not purely when we dream, we are always dreaming of the same kind of liberation. And so I'm enthusiastic of all of us imagining and dreaming together. And also want to recognize, right, that these are things that are happening, and that teachers and teacher educators, we've been complicit in this work. I think we've been thinking about the ways that maybe the topics that are debated in classrooms may center perspectives that dehumanize, right, that may oppress. And so while it's also we no longer have the language of fragility, maybe this is a push against that. We may not need the language of microaggressions, right? I think that's been a useful tool, but maybe they're just aggressions at this point, and it's violence. And so I think there's some framing that we need to think about in terms of our vocabulary. And then the last acknowledgement, I think, as I think about the words that are kind of funneling into the everyday language, and at least in the meetings that I get dragged into right now, the new normal, learning loss, reading gaps, these look a whole lot like the eras of assessment and No Child Left Behind that have been with us for generations at this point. And so this feels like a recognition that, you know, the new normal is the old normal at this point. And if we're going to resist that, and I think Dr. Haddix is going to help us think about that in a few minutes here, right? This is a time for us to be pushing on this. Nicole, do you want to add anything here?
Yeah, I think just the idea that, kind of taken from a participant in one of the studies we've been working on, I hesitate, but I do have hope. So again, at the same time that we lay out this pretty dire situation, and the fact that, you know, beyond just this pandemic, there's been a need for speculative thought and a need for alternative, otherwise worlds for a very long time. But we still have hope, and especially when we come together like this, we're really inspired by what speculative fiction, speculative thinking can do to help us disrupt our frames and think about ways we can disrupt what we have around us in small ways and in big ways. So we just want to mention really quickly, we have a lot of friends in this space, but we always, you know, we're always adding new folks to our space. So we want to just call out some community norms, especially because we've got a doc that is open as well as a webinar. We're trying to encourage as much interactivity as we can, but we also know that when we do that, unfortunately, there's often a time in which Black, Indigenous, and people of color, women, members of the LGBTQ+ community, and others can be subject to violence even in these online spaces. So Antero and I and a lot of our friends are going to be moderating the chat. We just ask everyone to make this a space of love and a space of community, and that because of that, those frames, any kind of speech or behavior that violates those will not be tolerated. We don't have time for that here. We've got lots of work to do, and we want everyone to be doing it together in love. And then we also just want to mention really quickly, the pandemic obviously spurred us to create the first Speculative Ed Colloquium, but of course these ideas and the need for this work has been going on for generations and generations. We just happen to be inspired by the 1964 Freedom School curriculum, the work of Ella Baker and so many others. You can access the entire curriculum online. These are the questions that we talked about last year that we just want to return to, because the work, as Antero said, is not done, nowhere near done, hasn't made as much progress in the last year as we would have preferred. But the idea here is that the civil rights movement and Black struggles for freedom are often couched in a narrative of wanting this society in which we are currently living, the frameworks that we are currently within, just making them incrementally better. But that's never what the struggle has been about. The struggle was always about creating an entirely new society, because the freedom of Black people creates freedom for the rest of humanity, and that is a world that we have not yet created. And those are the questions that students were asking in the freedom schools. Not how do we integrate into this society, but how do we create a society that is worthy of us, of our dignity and our grace and our genius. What do we want to keep? What do we have? What do we have here that we don't want? And what do we want for the future? So we want those same questions to be the questions that guide the Speculative Ed Colloquium moving forward. Why are we here at this colloquium today? What is it about the idea of the speculative that has drawn us to this conversation? What alternatives can that frame offer us within a movement in which a lot of us are working and living within institutions that are not working for our young people and for our communities? So what's not present that we want? What is present that we want to get rid of? And what do we want to hold on to? So we want you to keep thinking about these ideas, put your ideas in the chat, put your ideas in the sandbox, and we're going to keep on thinking about that as we move forward. So really quickly, again, what we're going to do is right now we're going to introduce Dr. Haddix, and we're going to have a keynote and a Q&A. So we're excited for you to put any questions that you have in the chat, and we will have time for Q&A after Dr. Haddix's talk. But later on, after the keynote is over, we will be breaking up into small discussion sections, and we want to thank our friends who will be introducing a little bit later, some friends who've so generously volunteered to host and facilitate those breakout rooms so that you can get into these ideas in a non-webinar format. So we'll give you more information about that just pretty soon. But first, Antero, we've got some exciting announcements.
We've got some big announcements. I think, I think the first announcement is there's a lot of us here today, and there is so much potential for us to act transformatively together. And so I want to underscore that as the biggest kind of first point is the big news is us, right? And the work that we can do. And so I want to hold that commitment, right? This is if you're like me, you've gotten, I think, an email hourly from AERA about figuring out their poster system. And while I don't need any more AERA emails, I can think about the ways that there's energy invested in a space, and the kind of net output that comes from these big academic conferences aren't necessarily as big as they could be. And this is a space where, we are using resources from Rutgers and Stanford today, but this is not a university funded event. This is an us event, right? This is all of us here together. And so let's use that potential for what we can. The second announcement, which I think Nicole's going to make in a second, I think we can confirm because Susan is in the attendees, so she can at least shoot this down if this isn't correct. But Nicole, you want to go into the second announcement? Yeah,
we're drawing on the last year we had an amazing talk from Dr. Kei-Wayne Yang, who told us about how decolonizing work. There's no shame in using any of the resources that our universities give us or that's part of academia. It can all be part of the struggle. So yes, it is an academic journal and an academic articles, but that's part of the struggle too. We want to put this knowledge out there in all different kinds of forms. And the Journal of the Learning Sciences is doing such amazing work. We want to keep pushing that field forward. And we were so lucky and honored that we're going to be able to create a special issue around the idea of speculative education and what it means to create liberatory forms of policy, practice, and research. So that call will be coming out soon. So keep an eye out if you're writing about this work, if you're doing this work. We want to use the collaborative and the ongoing network to create kind of like a movement for speculative education in all different kinds of forms. So we're excited about that opportunity as being one way to get this work out pretty soon into the future. And then
and the last thing, we are grateful to have gotten funding from the Spencer Foundation to sponsor next year's Speculative Education Colloquium. And so as we know, this work is not going anywhere anytime soon. We cannot give you the save the date. Save April. Just hold all of April. And we'll
just every month. Just hold every month.
We will be continuing this work, and we'll be figuring this out. And we're hoping to figure out opportunities to engage with all of you in the meantime between now and then.
Yeah, so I mean, that's our goal. Like, we just want to create spaces like this. We want all of you to suggest new spaces, use the sandbox. This doesn't belong to any one person. This is about kind of creating more and more opportunities for us to spread the word. So this is wonderful. And so in the spirit of that, we wanted to have someone with us who could inspire us and bring us to the next level. And there's no one better to do that than our keynote speaker, Dr. Marcelle Haddix. So Antero is going to give us an introduction.
Yeah, I think when Nicole and I were kind of hemming and I think we're dragging our feet on if we were going to do the second colloquium.
We're tired, everybody.
If you're you all, I'm sure you all feel the same way. It's really another webinar, and maybe you're feeling this at this very moment. But I think it was hearing Dr. Marcelle Haddix's articulation of Black futures and the imperatives of educators and educational researchers that helped push us into wanting to make this event a reality. It really is. In some sense, Marcelle, this is your fault, and so we're grateful for that. We'll take it. Dr. Haddix is Dean's Professor and Chair of the Reading and Language Arts Department in the Syracuse University School of Education, where she is an inaugural co-director of the Lender Center for Social Justice. She is the past president of the Literacy Research Association and recently was selected as the 2021 winner of the Divergent Award for Excellence in Literacy Advocacy, given by the Initiative for 21st Century Literacies Research. The titles are long. In her work, Dr. Haddix intentionally centers the perspectives, ideas, and brilliance of racially and linguistically diverse teachers and young people, and blending her ongoing day-to-day commitments to justice with a broadened perspective on where education could be headed. Marcelle's work embodies the speculative as we're hoping to think about it today. In February, Marcelle was in conversation with a handful of us here at Stanford, and one of my colleagues asked Dr. Haddix about the pragmatics related to how we might go about eking ever closer to justice in our teacher education programs. Recognizing that our teacher education programs bloated with the flotsam and jetsam of compliance, bureaucracy, and good intentions, Dr. Haddix asked our teacher ed faculty quite simply, what are you going to give up? It's a question I've been invoking frequently since then. I have an APA reference for what are you gonna give up, Haddix 2021. Our field continues to be dazzled down the pathway of more of busyness, of the rhetoric of learning loss and achievement gaps, and Dr. Haddix's work refuses the pathway of these historically racist narratives, and I'm grateful to imagine new routes with her today. Please join us in welcoming Dr. Marcelle Haddix.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Nicole and Antero and Stephanie. Your opening, the introduction, the acknowledgements, the framing is just so spot on. And I'm just really happy to be here with you all today. Let me get myself together. All right, I hope you all can see that. All right. So again, thank you and welcome everyone. I want to begin by first centering myself and grounding myself in this talk through my own spiritual, ancestral, and familial acknowledgements. I have to give honor where honor is due. It's what we used to say back in church when I used to go to church. I do this by honoring the land where I reside and the people, those who came before, those who are with me now, and those who will come long after I'm gone. I acknowledge the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the indigenous people of the Onondaga Nation, the people of the Haudenosaunee, where I am physically located here in Syracuse, New York. I offer reverence and to Black women and men who labored and continue to labor so that I can be here. May their spirit and memory be with us today and during these times. I give a shout out to my family and friends and community in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Seattle, Washington, and here in Syracuse. I also just want to pause for a moment and invite all of you just to check in with yourselves right now. How do you feel? How is your body, your mind? How is your heart? We stay living through some troubling times, and I know it can feel like we're just holding our breath, waiting for the what's next. So I invite you to be kind and have grace for yourselves, to take the time for you and embrace peace and joy, even through and with the trauma and pain we deal with on a regular. We've lived through a year of the unexpected and unknowns, a year of individual and collective loss and grieving, a year of endings and new beginnings, a year of new possibilities and opportunities, a year that revealed so much strength and courage. I've said to many that I learned so much about myself during this year. While there have been many challenges and even disappointments, I'm so grateful for what the year taught me. I hope for all of you that you've been able to reflect on the many unfoldings that the past year manifested, and that you're renewed and recharged as we continue to journey forward now in 2021. So last year, this time, many of our professional and academic conferences were making pivots to online platforms as the world shut down. And I remember being in awe of this offering that Dr. Zantero Garcia and Nicole Mira created, the Speculative Education Colloquium. I know as you register for today's event, you were asked to think about what speculative means to you, and I'm happy to be a part of the conversation today. But if the last year has shown us anything, and it has shown us a lot, it gives a solid reason for why the speculative is so important in this moment. Why imagining and creating possible futures is critical in this time, in a world that would have us to think that Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian, disabled, and queer and trans people do not matter in the past, in the present, nor in the future. So I'm grateful to you, Nicole and Antero, for answering the call for this space and for cultivating this community. That in and of itself is what I would call a speculative act. And I'm honored to be your keynote for the second annual colloquium. And again, thank you to everyone who was on the webinar today. I look forward to thinking, learning, and growing with you. And as I said, feel free to put your questions or comments in the chat as we'll have time to engage at the end. So are you ready for Black Future Month? Possible Futures and the Black Imagination. The image that you see here is from Alicia Wormsley. This was her entry for the last billboard project, and this could be seen at the top of a building in East Liberty, Pennsylvania until 2018, when the tenants who were upset asked that it be taken down due to what they called troubling content. But she dared to believe and to declare that yes, there are Black people in the future. And I just want to pause to say I will be sharing several references and images throughout my talk. And again, if you have any questions about a citation or a source, or you want to learn more, please ask. I'm happy to reiterate and share any information. This one in particular can be found in the edited collection, Black Futures, by Kimberly Drew and Jenna Wortham, which will come up again later. In this talk, I hope to guide us in time travel to explore Black-centered remembrances in education. And I'll focus specifically in teaching and teacher education from the past, present, and future. I ask that you consider with me, what possibilities are we willing to see and cultivate for a better education and a better world? What will it take for us to honor and listen to Black voices on educational freedom and liberation? What have we learned by bearing witness to our individual and collective past, and in this current moment about the possibilities for change? Are we ready to embrace a Black future? My thoughts today are inspired by Black futurists, writers, artists, and architects, and I've organized what I will share in the form of my own testimonies, interspersed with examples from lived experiences, my ruminations on research and scholarship, and in celebration of Black imagination and memory. I hope to move us toward exploring these questions and ideas that may contribute to a geography for possible futures in teaching and teacher education. At the beginning of the pandemic, I had already taken on a 52 book reading challenge, reading all Black women writers. That if I had a New Year's resolution, I would say that that was it. And I will say in 2020, I did meet my challenge. And I'm always excited to talk about books and what I'm currently reading. But as much as I love to read, I had grown apart at that time from my love of reading, always too busy to read for pleasure, even with the community book clubs that I run here in Syracuse. I want to shout out the Soulful Saturday Sisters and the Breed Love Readers. I was always that one person who would come to the book club mainly for the wine and the sisterhood, but I could never find time to finish the book. Always too busy. But in 2020, I wanted that to change. So I started this journey of reading more books and revisiting many of my favorite genres, especially romance, suspense thrillers, and fantasy and sci-fi, science fiction. And I figured this was an opportunity for me to return to Octavia Butler. I had never, at that time, I had never read the Parable series. So I started with Parable of the Sower, which was a huge mistake. Those of you who have read this book can imagine where this may be going. When I tell you that just reading that book was giving me heart palpitations at the beginning of the pandemic, we were just at the beginning, and you couldn't, at that time, remember, you couldn't find toilet paper in the stores. Millions of people were losing their jobs. For the first time, families found themselves in never-ending lines for food shares by the food bank. The government was a corrupt disgrace. Octavia told us this, and she warned of this in 1993. So I had to put the book down because her Black imagination, her prophecy, was suffocating to me. I put the book down until I could gather myself. In the moment, I was not ready for the real possibilities of where we were and are headed or were heading, even as real as it was. Of Butler's writing, Hepzibah Anderson wrote in a March 2020 column of the BBC Culture, like much of her writing, Butler's book was a warning about where the US and humanity in general might be headed. In some respects, we've beaten her to it. A sequel to the 1993's Parable of the Sower, Parable of the Talents, is set in what is still the future, 2032. While its vision is extreme, there is plenty that fills within the bounds of possibility. Resources are increasingly scarce. The planet is boiling. Religious fundamentalism is rife. The middle classes live in walled off enclaves. 14 years after her early death, Butler's reputation is soaring. Her predictions about the direction that the US politics would take and the slogan that would help speed it there are certainly uncanny. It is no denying it. We've been manifesting this moment, the terror, the violence, the scarcity, the competition, the despair. The planet said enough. The universe said enough. COVID and all that came with it was a kind of tipping point. Well, actually what I'm reading currently is Cicely Tyson's memoir, Just As I Am. And she, as you all know, recently passed away, but in her memoir, she actually says, this is a tipping point because enough whites are now suffering alongside communities of color. The despair is something that communities of color are and have always grappled with. But many have said, as the world has changed, we will and can never go back to the way things were, and that we shouldn't want to. This is a long way of me getting to my reading and continued exploration into Black futurist thought and imagination. To understand this current moment, I found myself leaning into speculative and science fiction by Black women writers like Butler, N.K. Jemisin, the inspiration for the title of this talk, which I'll come back to later, and Misha Green, writer of the HBO series Lovecraft Country. These texts were my balm, a healing salve for me during a challenging year, but a year of possibilities, of new ways for me to see and have faith. In framing my talk, the theme of time travel is central and deeply inspired by my love of Lovecraft Country. For more on Lovecraft, I'd invite you and encourage you to check out Dr. Kenitra Brooks' her work that looks critically at the treatment of Black women in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. But she had an awesome series on The Root, where she led conversations about Lovecraft. So without giving away too many spoilers, in Lovecraft Country, Uncle George's travel book is inspired by Victor Hugo Green's The Negro Motorist Green Book, which is one of the many references to literature found throughout the series. Green's annual guidebook for African-American road trippers was published from 1936 to 1966 during the era of segregation and intense Jim Crow laws. The Green Book served as a guide for the services and places that were friendly to Black people in a time when segregation and discrimination was widespread and perfectly legal across the United States. For more on the Green Book travel guide, I would recommend you checking out a current book by Candace Taylor, Overground Railroad, the Green Book and the Roots of Black Travel in America. While traveling, Black people were faced with threats of violence and threats to their life in what were known as the sundown towns. There's a scene in Lovecraft Country when the character Atticus is confronted by a police officer that tells him that in 7 minutes at sundown, his duty would be to kill him. It was situations like those that made Green's guide so necessary, and the reason why in the series, Uncle George finds it imperative to create. As your guide today, I use this literary and symbolic reference to remind us that while despite recent trends in embracing anti-racist frameworks, the underlying belief that Black lives do not matter persists. So it is through collective and shared wisdom and creativity and ingenuity that Black people have survived and thrived, traveling across time and spaces. And this is even within teaching and teacher education. As I've lived and traveled within and between white-centered spaces, still traveling through academic and education, quote unquote, sundown towns, my internal Green Book has been my resource and strength for centering Blackness in intentional opposition to the white gaze. Another example from the series that helped shape this talk comes from the 7th episode, the I Am episode. Reading Black women's stories and living during the pandemic, a time of more racial violence, corrupt politics, and more, I spent the past year in deep and critical reflection. The 7th episode of Lovecraft really resonated with me for that reason. In this episode, again, I'll try not to give any spoilers, but I really recommend that you watch the series if you have not. The character Hippolyta arrives onto what appears to be a planet somewhere in space. She is in a magical and strange kind of time travel, but we really don't know where she is. Is she in the future? Is this some kind of extraterrestrial ship? Before she can figure it out, two beings looking both robotic and alien approach her. She wakes up in a white room, nude, and with purple implants in her wrists. She is greeted by a tall Black being with a large shaped afro who speaks in code, repeating iterations of, "You are not in prison. Where do you want to be? Name yourself." I don't know about you, but in the year of the pandemic, I was asking myself similar kinds of questions. Why am I here? Who am I? What is most important in my life? What is my legacy? What is my purpose? What is the mark on the world I want to make and leave? What is the purpose of this work? At the time, I had requests to write reports, policy columns, and book chapters, all on teacher education. And I paused in that year to ask, to what end? What is this all for? These were questions of identity and of purpose. And like Hippolyta, I was reclaiming time and space to even pause and ask these questions and to go further by exploring them. And even deeper, I was leaning into the possibilities of Black futures. What does it mean to be Black and alive right now? How could my work be rededicated and committed to those who are coming in the future? Afrofuturism dares to suggest that not only will Black people exist in the future, but that we will be makers and shapers of it too. And that's a quote from Florence Okoye in the Black Futures book. So as I think about envisioning futures for teaching and teacher education, my thoughts continue to evolve. Sure, those of you who know my work and have heard me talk before know that I typically don't sugarcoat or mince my words. I say what I say and I mean and live what I say. I try to make it plain, but Black futurism demands of us to ask, what do we do and how do we survive after the world ends? What really matters here, now, and for the future? With that, our first stop on this journey will be 2003, when and where my journey in studying and understanding the field of teaching and teacher education began, my doctoral program. When, not new to me, this experience not new to me, I was the only Black woman in my program's cohort. In my first required doctoral seminar, the course was titled Research on Teaching. Our culminating assignment was to write a literature review on a specific topic in the research on teaching. Just as I have been reading my way to greater understanding of self and of being as a Black woman, I knew instantly that I wanted to understand what the research had to say about Black teachers like me, specifically about Black women teachers. That was my first doctoral paper, my first literature review, and it was on the subject of my first American Educational Research Association paper. And Antero, I had to chuckle at your comment about all of the steady emails that we're getting right now around poster sessions. But I remember that frantic rush to prepare for AERA. But that was when and where I entered into the educational research community. I encountered the work of Black women scholars like Michelle Foster, Annette Henry, Gloria Ladson-Billings, Carol Lee, Arnita Ball, Geneva Smitherman, Cynthia Dillard, Joyce King, and so many others. I read for the first time in my educational career, Black Feminist Thought by Patricia Hill Collins. I read the narratives of scholar and educator Anna Julia Cooper. My Black feminist introduction to education was self-initiated and self-guided. While the invitation to write on a topic of my interest was presented to me, Black life and Black education was not evidenced on the curriculum nor centered or required as a part of my doctoral education, no different from educational experiences I had had prior. But I just knew that I needed to start with self and create and shape the space that was Black and female. I found myself reading research studies, and I should clarify, those studies that centered Black feminist praxis, rendered visible the experiences and audible the voices of Black women teachers and pre-service teachers, where I found my own experience becoming a teacher in teacher education represented. I was not alone in my present experiences. I was a part of a collective history. Little bit known to me, I was shaping and creating my internal green book for navigating the white-centered space of teacher education and educational research. This research exploration called me to reflect on my own experience growing up in the Black community of segregated Milwaukee in the 70s and 80s, and being a part of a voluntary Chapter 220 busing program for high school, where I was bused from the inner city to the white suburbs for a tracked high school education. The image that you see here is from a column that is part of a special series called From Mississippi to Milwaukee, My Journey to 53206 by Reggie Jackson. And that series explores the 53206 zip code in Milwaukee in an effort to educate about the historical context and social process that drove a once very thriving part of the city into its current condition. What it signifies for me, much of what I understand about my own educational experience and that of the family generations before me. So let's go to 1992. The 1992 Los Angeles riots erupted after the officers accused of beating Rodney King were acquitted. In 1992, Mae Carol Jemison became the first African-American woman to travel in space when she went into orbit aboard the space shuttle Endeavour. Carol Moseley Brown became the first African-American woman to be elected to the United States Senate on November 3rd, 1992. Director Spike Lee's film Malcolm X was released in 1992. In 1992, I was rocking with Tribe Called Quest, Mary J. Blige, Boyz II Men, and the Boomerang soundtrack. 1992 was the year that I would graduate from high school, where I was the first Black prom queen and homecoming queen, where my then high school sweetheart would become my life partner, now married 25 years. High school for us, the Black kids, meant getting on the yellow Chapter 220 buses, standing out on the street corner in the wee hours of the morning, waiting for the magic bus ride to take us to the educational promise that our parents had hoped for us. In 1992, my dreams of college were colored by my favorite TV sitcom, A Different World. And coincidentally, I've been watching the episodes currently on TV One. So if you want to get caught up or revisit A Different World, it is available to you. But I wanted to be like Whitley Gilbert. I imagined the Black college experience, living in the dorms with other Black girls, being educated by Black teachers. But in reality, in my K-12 experience, were outside my mother, my grandmothers, aunties, and church other mothers, I never had a teacher who looked like me. My teachers were white. The books and the curriculum that they gave me were largely white authors. While I did not have Black teachers, I sought examples. So for a Black history profile assignment my senior year, I decided to research and learn more about the life of educator Mary McLeod Bethune. Where were the teachers who looked like me? Yet and still in 1992, I decided that I wanted to go to college to become a teacher. And in college, I would be the only Black woman in my pre-service teacher education program. My professors and teacher educators would be white. My cooperating teachers were white. My supervisors were white. Who would mentor me to becoming a Black woman teacher? Who would be my community? My return to self has been at the core of my research in teaching and teacher education. I often say to my students, research inquiries can always be traced back to the personal. You can and you will find me in my research. I don't hide that truth. My early teacher education research would center the experiences of Black and Latina pre-service teachers. My work as a literacy scholar in teacher education has largely been about listening to, believing, and responding to the experiences of Black pre-service teachers and Black parents. While I've engaged research methodologies and theoretical frameworks that illuminate the issues, to what end? As a community engaged Black feminist activist, while critical, it is not enough for me to know and understand. What do we do about it? And for me, Black futurism points to answers and solutions. So let's venture to 2020. Remember New Year's Eve 2019? We were all so ready to let that year go because 2019 was a beast, but little did we know. Right at the onset of 2020, we were rocked by the untimely death of Kobe Bryant and his daughter, Gigi. Things just didn't feel right. My last trip on a plane, anyway, was to Nick Tier in Nashville. At that time, we were seeing images of people dying from the coronavirus in other parts of the world. Yet I could not wrap my mind around why our public officials seemed not to understand or refuse to understand the connection of the spread of the virus to us here in the United States. What kept us from understanding the far-reaching depth of human connection. And then there was COVID. Schools shut down. There was an immediate pivot to remote teaching, learning, and working. At the time, I was teaching an EDU 100 course for secondary education students on teaching for Black lives. The Rethinking Schools edited collection was our anchor text, along with other readings like the 1619 Project, the Netflix docuseries When They See Us, and the oral histories of the Black people living right here in the Southside community of Syracuse. The course was an introduction to becoming a teacher, 35 students, majority white. We met Tuesdays and Thursdays in the morning at 8 a.m. So you can imagine that was challenging in and of itself. And of course, I was met with, this isn't what I was expecting this course to be about. And what does this have to do with teaching? And then COVID. Even in a time of a global pandemic, our country's allegiance to its deep history of enslaving and killing Black, Brown, and Indigenous people resurged again, never went away. Racial violence never left, and millions around the world were protesting for systemic and material changes that underscored the belief that Black lives matter. February 23rd, 2020, Ahmaud Arbery, an unarmed 25-year-old Black man, was chased and gunned down by two white men, Gregory and Travis McMichael, while jogging in Glenn County, Georgia. March 13th, 2020, Breonna Taylor, a 26-year-old Black woman, was killed by police while sleeping in her Louisville, Kentucky apartment. March 23rd, 2020, Daniel Prude, a 41-year-old Black man, was suffering from a mental health episode when he was killed by police in Rochester, New York. May 25th, 2020, in Minneapolis, Minnesota, George Floyd, a 46-year-old Black man, while being arrested for allegedly using a counterfeit $20 bill, was killed by police officer Derek Chauvin, who knelt on George Floyd's neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. The murders of innocent Black people were on full display for a society on pause due to COVID. I am not currently watching the trial of Derek Chauvin, but I did come across a tweet from journalist Yamiche Alcindor, where she said, the next 4 witnesses who watched George Floyd plead for his life as Derek Chauvin kneeled on his neck are not being shown on camera because they are so young. Let that sink in. Too young to be shown on camera, but witnesses in a murder trial. This is where we are. Anti-Black violence and racism was and is not new to me or within communities of color. But this moment in 2020 felt different. At least I wanted to hope that this time was different and that the outpouring of anger against racial violence would not simply fade away. All of a sudden, there were countless virtual offerings, webinars, and panel discussions on how to be anti-racist. Businesses and organizations and universities released statements pledging anti-racist values and solidarity with Black Lives Matter movements. It became honorable to take a knee as an individual protest against police brutality and anti-Black violence. Juneteenth Day, a day that conjures up for me my childhood memories of Black beauty, excellence, and joy, received national attention. Suddenly, with calls for national holidays to paintings of murals, and even the wearing of kente cloth by public officials, these symbolic acts of allyship served to minimize the significance of this history for Black Americans and took attention away from the very real and necessary cause for change in the way this country deals with its racist past and present. In 2020, we were living during a time of a major health and economic crisis and a racial crisis. The moment called for a kind of reckoning. How do we respond? The pandemics offered a chance for new opportunities and new ways of being. that reckon with the past while restoring the present and creating the future. How do we move beyond these temporary and in some instances inauthentic displays of allyship toward doing the work that will enact systemic change? Before now, there were many Black truth tellers who tried to tell us. Mama Tony told us. Uncle Jimmy told us. Black people told us. There's research literature that told us. But here we are, people scrambling to Black-owned bookstores to buy copies of White Fragility and How to Be Anti-Racist. Now we want to have anti-racist curriculum and anti-racist teaching. Now we want to, quote unquote, decolonize syllabi. And I say quote because I'm not sure that the people that say that actually know what they mean when they say it. I understand that change can take time and change can happen in unexpected ways. And if we look to Octavia, we understand that change is everything. The only lasting truth is change. But change to what end? And this change for how long? And is it just change in service to whiteness? The pandemics had direct impact on policies in higher education and in teaching and teacher education. I'll just list a few of the areas where I've seen over the years some swift policy changes. And you may note a few more in the organizations and institutions that you're affiliated with. But standardized testing, GRE, SAT, and admissions requirements, virtual and online teaching and learning, tuition discounts, accessibility, IDEA and DEI training. I list these because these are all the areas where years of research have noted the very real educational inequities that policies have maintained that disproportionately affect communities of color. For example, when asked to waive GRE and SAT requirements because of the ways that they disadvantage students of color, the test scores were just one indicator of academic promise. The pandemic happens, enrollments suffer, more families, or more white families, as Queen Cicely would say, are economically impacted. We no longer need to require these scores. This year let us witness what was possible when white people's survival was threatened. What do we do and how do we survive after the world ends? Is it time yet that we recognize and honor the people and communities whose very existence is an exemplar of continual appraisal of this question and more? The Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian, disabled, immigrant, trans, and queer communities that understand the power of collectivity in claiming, creating, and shaping future possibilities. I'm going to pause here. When I said this is kind of the clunky part of my presentation, I want to show a video, a brief video. And I'll explain more.
Black habits, yeah, everything, black chucks, everything, black hug, black love, everything.
Yeah, what are you listening to?
My flowers, why they still give black roses? everything black child.
It's old school. My grandma said it was her grandma's favorite.
Skin noir, friends noir, here you are, black. Everything you need, better believe you are that. Skin noir, friends noir, here you are, black. Everything you need, better believe you are.
Shit. Freedom Summer.
Peace, child. I am your ancestor.
Yo.
My time has come and gone now.
Insane.
And though you may not know of us, know that we loved you in advance. We anticipated your brilliance and broke what chains that we could to build the world that you deserve. Tell me, do they teach a Freedom Summer in the year of 2020?
Brianna, Titi, we lost so many that summer. So much strange fruit.
The pandemics of COVID-19 and police brutality.
Something broke open in us. I don't have any words. Our people, we rose up everywhere. Every city, every night. We fought for you, for your freedom. I'll never forget those nights, those streets. 26 million strong.
26 million strong. The empire trembled, and suddenly there were cracks. Confederate flags banned. Public safety reimagined.
And get cops out of schools.
Workers striking in defense of Black lives.
We will say her name.
The WNBA, then the NBA. Game after game canceled. Dangerous electeds voted out of office. We tore down the statues of our oppressors. Our people began to dream and fight for a world without policing, a world free of the brutal grind of capitalism.
I am somebody. And I deserve.
We carried our people to office.
With our fists in the air.
When cities started passing reparations bills, we wrote our own laws. And you are our wildest, freest dreams. We flooded the streets for you, for your health.
For your wealth. We spoke your liberation into being, into law, into land.
Child, if our work is not done, if you do not awaken every morning into Black power and Black love, then you must make your liberation whole. We are with you, and we know that you will win. Remember how we fought for you in the summer of 2020 and take back the power.
You were our mandate.
We have a mandate. And damn it, we gon' do it. Call and response. The mandate for Black people in this time. To avenge the suffering of our ancestors. To earn the respect of future generations. And be willing to be transformed in the service of the world.
That is a trailer for a film, Black Futures, an ode to Freedom Summer by the movement for Black lives. So what will we remember of the year 2020? And how will we teach about this in the future? What are we manifesting for the generations to come? So now we go to the year 2022. Travel with me to the future. Imagine teacher education as if Black lives mattered and their voices were heard. What can happen when we invite Black students and teachers and parents to have a seat at the table, to not only share their experiences in teacher education, but to design new possibilities for teacher education that fortifies and sustains their commitments to teaching and learning? Instead of research designs that position Black students as participants and respondents, how might we begin to think about teacher education and education research that repositions them as architects of design? What is our responsibility as education researchers who draw on voice methodologies to disrupt spaces that exclude racialized voices and experiences? How might we use our findings to redirect education reform locally as well as more broadly? We have to stop just asking Black people, in this instance, Black students, Indigenous students, Latinx students, Asian students, queer and non-gender conforming students, disabled students, and any other students oppressed within and by our programs in our educational system to attend listening sessions or open forums to share their experiences dealing with racism and violence in white spaces. Doing so only further perpetuates trauma and violence toward these students. They share their individual and collective pain while the systems and institutions do little to nothing to change. Most recently in my own work, I did a reanalysis of research data on a study that I conducted with an advisee and now colleague at Vassar College, Dr. Kimberly Williams-Brown. We were holding focus groups and individual interviews with students of color in teaching and teacher education. From the reanalysis of our research data, we wanted to change the ways that we conceptualized and thought about our work with students of color in teacher ed. In particular, while we acknowledge the utility of in-depth interview study methodology, we know that we cannot just stop there. This study analysis called upon us to think critically about the ways that we enter into research inquiries involving students, and to especially lead with the resolve to affect tangible change for current and future designs. And this is just in teacher education research and teacher education programs. So through a process of reanalysis, we thought through how to ensure upfront that our work had direct alignment to teacher ed decisions and outcomes. This involves shifting the power dynamics, asking questions that directly relate to programmatic decisions, envisioning avenues to relate student voice and input to program outcomes, and then seeing it through. The work does not and cannot end with just focus groups and one-on-one interviews. Reframing the role of students of color in teacher education reform from participants to future architects of design shifts power dynamics and acknowledges the knowledge and agency that they bring to their own education and development. So let me just pause for a moment to say, it pains me to see and understand how a metaphoric green book for Black people traveling through teaching and teacher education is still being passed down from generation to generation. That is not what I want to leave for the generations that come. This is what has to stop. Yes, Black people will continue to survive and thrive and do what needs to be done to create the best educative opportunities for our children and communities. but how and when will the systems and structures change that protect and serve whiteness in K-12 schools and colleges of education? What will teaching and teacher education be in the future, in your future? So I pose this question to you, to all of us, and ask that you reflect and imagine the future that you want to make possible for the generations to come. So how long till Black Future Month? And are you ready? The writer N.K. Jemisin, whose title for this collection of short stories was inspired by Afrofuturist Janelle Monáe, and whose work inspired the title of today's talk, said of her own writing, "It's also a meditation on how hard it's been for me to love science fiction and fantasy as a Black woman. How much I've had to fight my own internalized racism, in addition to that radiating from the fiction and the business. How terrifying it's been to realize that no one thinks my people have a future, and how gratifying to finally accept myself and begin spinning the futures I want to see." I recently had an opportunity to watch a stage performance of Twilight, 1992, which was a play that was written and first performed by Anna Deavere Smith, where she interviewed and portrayed a diverse range of people right after the acquittal of the officers in the Rodney King case that ignited the 1992 LA riots. One of the individuals that she represented is Dr. Cornel West, who is he was currently trending. He may still be, though I've seen him talking about some other things of late, about the situation in Harvard. Of hope and optimism, he says, "Any talk of despair is not where you end, but where you start. The courage and sacrifice come in at the level of hope, not optimism. Optimism is more rational. It's secular. Hope looks at the evidence and says it doesn't look good at all, but we're going to make the leap of faith beyond the evidence to attempt to create new possibilities based on the visions that become so contagious that people can engage in heroic actions." Octavia Butler was not a prophet, but she looked beyond the evidence. She was a historian, a kind of ethnographer who imagined past the evidence of what was right in front of us. Black future shapers, creators, and dreamers say that their work, their legacy, is dedicated to those who are coming and demand us to grow. That's a quote from Utunda Alagbaju in the Black Futures book. There is a responsibility to think past the present. So taken together, I believe these issues are critical and should be central to any education platform. More clearly, any agenda for teaching and teacher education must hold as truth that Black lives matter and that there will be Black people in the future. You cannot untether Blackness and Black futures work from education. There will be Black people in the future. In my mind and in my imagination, the future will very much be Black, and she will be a woman, a girl or a woman. As you can see, I am a lover of books, text, films, and stories. I love to write, create, and dream. My Black feminist praxis is fueled by my heart and my imagination, my desires and pleasure, and by joy. I want collective healing and restoration for the Black community, for all people, because I believe when Black girls and women, the mules of the earth, are seen, valued, loved, and respected, when our lives truly matter, we will be there. We will be closer to peace, love, and humanity for all. And thank you. That is the end of my talk. I'm happy to engage in conversation. I will stop share.
Thank you so much, Dr. Haddix. I think we're all just like pausing in gratitude and just amazement. you'll see the waterfall in the chat of just thanks. And the chat that's been going on the entire time. We need to get you the entire chat.
I'll have to see.
Folks have just been just loving it.
Oh, thank you, everyone.
Yeah, it's incredible. And once the ovation has been concluded, we want to ask people to also use the chat to ask questions. For Dr. Haddix, we wrote down a few things that we saw in the chat, but I think that Antero and I should we get it started with a few questions? Antero, you want to start, or you want me to start?
Yeah, I can start. I think I might have a rambly question for you, Marcelle, to start. And I know, Jose, I see you have something in the Q&A, so thanks for pulling that there. Marcelle, I've heard you talk a little bit about this already, and part of my attention of what I really appreciate learning from is, I think the vast majority of people in teacher education have no idea that they are in sundown towns, let alone the fact that a personal green book needs to exist for many folks within this program, within these programs. As someone, I apologize, I can't remember in the chat, who recognized that as you were talking about the many folks we lost in 2020, they all attended schools in America, right? The folks that you're talking about. And so thinking about these pieces, I wonder both, what are the processes through which we might need to make explicit the sundown towns of teacher education and of schooling without having to fall into the traps of allyship? And while also, while also making that explicit, we don't necessarily want those sundown towns. We want entirely new spaces entirely. So I'm trying to figure out like that kind of bridging.
Absolutely. And that was, point I kind of made toward the end, is that when I think about what I want to leave for future generations, I don't want to leave a green book. But the reality is, in my time, that will likely be necessary, just as it was necessary for the generations that came before me and my ancestors. And it really wasn't, as I was going through my own educational experiences, I was not consciously aware of the maps and the tools and the information that was being passed down to me indirectly, informally, by, Black folks who came before me. And so I do think there is kind of this just natural, organic way within communities of color that we hold each other up, and we make sure to equip and support each other and our youth and the generations that are coming. Sometimes good ways and bad ways, but it's the work that we do in terms of just trying to make sure that people not only survive but thrive into the future. But you asked a question about like institutionally, like what can organizations and systems do? I mean, I think first is this notion of being a sundown town. Like first is acknowledging the policies and the practices that you have in place. And the thing that's been challenging for me, but so real over the last year, is how many instances like that I will see stuff in my day-to-day work, in a school of education, in a higher ed, in a university space. And I don't know if it's something about Zoom or the online, but it makes it even like hyper visible for me, where I'm constantly having to because I'm not going to stay silent, name it, like, you're doing this right now. And this email, I could just do a discourse analysis and show you how you're enacting certain kinds of violence toward me or to students of color or communities of color, whatever. Like there's constantly things that I see on a day-to-day, weekly basis. So I think there is something to it, but the labor shouldn't always have to be on us. And I appreciate those individuals that first will do the self-work to understand how they're implicated in it. But then, as you're doing that work, also call the stuff out. Like I hate when I'll have to call something out in a meeting, and then my white colleague will send me an email, or now, with Zoom, you can private chat and say, oh, I was gonna say something. I noticed that too, or I felt, don't do that. Thank you. No more private messages. Like you need to call that out. Like, why is it always that you all are like, okay, for me to be the one to put myself out there and you see it too, but you don't say anything. So, you know, a lot of it, I think, is just like right in front of us, but people have to be, dare I say, no, because I don't know if it's courageous or brave, but they just need to say something. They need to do something.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yes, and I think it leads to two questions that are related that just popped up in the Q&A. From our friends, Dr. Jose Lizarraga and Dr. Stephanie Jones. They're kind of related questions that kind of pick up on this issue. Jose asked, what are Dr. Haddix's views on what coalition building looks like? Seriously struggling with this. We can't assume that white colleagues have our best interests in mind, not because they are nefarious, though some are, but because they don't feel the violence like we do. And then as attacking on from Stephanie, what does coalition building look like based on identity politics? Just because we share identities with one another, how do I know that you are fighting for something that gives more life?
Yep. And I would say that I am still thinking with you all around these issues, because I do believe strongly that the work can happen in many different forms. There is no one way or right way only to do it. The first thing that I say, many of you know that I'm very much about health and wellness and self-preservation. And my own yoga and spiritual practice requires me to always be focused on my own needs and how I feel in my body and what I feel I need for my family and my community at all times. And so before I can do any kind of coalition or working with other people, I got to make sure that I feel all right and that I also have circles of protection around me. So that means tapping into the ancestral wisdom and knowledges that I have to draw from. That means making sure that I have my sister network around me when I need to tap into that. That makes sure that my family is well, you know, and okay. All those things, those circles of protection are so critical for me first, before I can even think about working with my white colleagues or other communities or other groups. You know, I have a saying that some people may have heard me say this: I don't respond to emails before 10 a.m., especially not from folks that will grate on my nerves. And so, because it requires me to get my mind right and to get myself right first. I appreciate that. All skin folk ain't kin folk, absolutely. And that's why I say, like, it's our white colleagues, but it's also whiteness. We take whiteness up and respectability and other kinds of things up. And I'm not placing any judgment, because people have the reasons that they draw on certain ideas and frameworks and ways of being in any particular moment. So I just try to, you know, again, making sure that my own circle of protection, but then have empathy and compassion and understanding before I react. And I think if people are really about coalition building and wanting to work with people across communities, that to me is a practice that you need to put in place, so that you're not just coming into something thinking that you're ready to do the work, because there's a lot that has to go into it. You know, just even dealing with the trauma and the healing work that we have to do in our own individual communities. You know, if the wounds are still fresh and open, and then you call yourself going into coalition, it just further hurts. So I would just offer that first, the healing and, yes, Stephanie, the healing and protection work.
There was a pragmatic question that I saw in chat. I'm just gonna try to catch up to it, from B. Charisse. I'm just saying the username that I see in the chat. And so I'll read what I see here. As a curriculum writer in a middle school, I was pleased to see more approved diverse texts for students. However, many teachers refuse to teach novels that make them uncomfortable and don't have to because of the adoption of teacher choice. While more options are available, students still aren't being exposed to diverse texts. How could this be rectified?
Yeah, that's a long issue. And I've been thinking a lot about, one of the things that I took on this year was to read and reread all of Toni Morrison's work, the 11 fiction novels. And every time I read another one of the books, I get upset and kind of like, they didn't give me Toni in high school. Like, you know, her first novels were what, 1973? Like, why did we not receive her work? So I find, that is just a complete cop out, and that, any curricular, and I know that I have colleagues and friends who put their jobs on the line because they continue to push their schools and their districts to make curricular changes, and they get a lot of resistance from parents and then students. And there are some districts that will then allow students or families to opt out, which is not the solution here. So I think these are the areas where teachers and teacher leaders, families, communities, and students have always been leading the way. We just have to continue to push at, because there's just, at this point, I mean, this is like a 3-4 decade old, debate. At this point, there's too many books and literature out here and available to us to still be using the same text. So I find that to be just, there's no excuse for it at this point. And I think it's just going to require, yes, please, let's dead the mockingbird. We just have to continue. And I'm not for the whole pairing, like, okay, we're going to teach Mockingbird, but then let's pair it with this. No, because you're still then centering certain texts. Some texts can just go. If we can say that this is a text that students can read on their own time, it's a supplementary text, that's the power dynamic, the power shift. Why can't that be the text that we teach in the classroom? And then they can go read the other books, because they'll find the other books. So yes, stop pairing with racists. This chat is on fire. It's wonderful. Yes, yeah. Hashtag disrupt text. There's just too many resources. There's too many people out here doing this work for folks to still be saying that they don't have. Yeah.
Right, and we were thinking about how, I was thinking about during the video that you showed how influential you've been in our field of literacy for making those cracks bigger, for breaking the chains that we could, and that we all have spheres of influence in which we could be breaking more chains for the young people to come. Your work with LRA, your work with within these structures of academia that are often these sundown towns. And I'm wondering how you would mentor the folks that are here in this chat who all have their own spheres of influence, even when they're dealing with this like equity language and all the stuff that we know is just like talk, but we have to use those cracks and just like do the work in them. Yeah. Like how do we keep doing that instead of just saying like, you know what, these places are irreparably just not going to change and we have to just dream, but how do we dream in these spaces right now?
Yeah, and Nicole, I appreciate you saying that. And that's why I appreciate the work that you and Antero have done in terms of pushing this work. You mentioned in your framing in the beginning about the journal. Yes, it's an academic journal, but you still see the utility and importance of forging this conversation in multiple spaces. There isn't just one way. But Lord, is it hard. I think, for me, I've been, in terms of just mentoring other people, I wouldn't say that I'm the person to follow in terms of how I've done certain things, because it certainly wasn't without their losses, and there certainly was a lot of challenge and pain. There were risks in terms of my own health and well-being. To the point in terms of, thanks, Pat, in terms of LRA, like I'm no longer a member. I'm not a member of AERA right now. I'm not a member of NCTE. And it's not because I don't value or think the work that these organizations are doing is important, but because I did that thing for a time, and it doesn't have to always be. And it doesn't mean that I can't return. And I think that's the thing about, when we talk about speculative or futurist kinds of work, like you got to imagine, you can't just keep staying in the same, like, this is the route, this is the academic journey, this is the way that you do it. You can do something different. You can dream something else, and that is okay. And you can get from point A to B to C to D and wherever you want to be. And so, I think that's been the freeing thing for me, and that I would offer to folks who are in that journey to say, like, yeah, okay, I want to do this right now, but hey, I see a call or a colloquium or a group that's meeting in future studies or in women and gender studies or in, queer studies, wherever you want to be, and engage in different things. For me right now, it's a lot of community work. I run a wellness cooperative here. We're doing a community garden. I'm doing a lot of work with folks here in the community. I run a reproductive health and healing center here. That's where I feel my energy needs to be right now. And I think that's the thing, to see, like, knowledge communities, we can expand and think differently about what matters and what counts and where we can affect change. And not think like, if I was doing this year, I got to continue to do it just because. If you're really taking on a speculative way of seeing things, or a Black futurist framing, you have to be very intentional. There's an intentionality around what you're doing. You don't just keep moving through just because. Like, you have to be really intentional about it. So I think that's really important.
We have a lot of questions kind of floating around, and we're not going to get to all of them from all of the different streams. And actually, I'm going to ask one more, and Michelle King, you had a question in the chat, and I don't know if there's a question directly to Marcelle or if it's a hypothetical, but I'm going to ask it anyways because I feel like it's maybe a good kind of landing point for moving us in the next steps. But Michelle asks, how might we rethink labor, power, surrender, and love when we think about our, in quotation marks, careers? The question.
So what the 4 words I heard? Love, surrender.
Rethink labor, power, surrender, and love.
Wow. Well, it goes back for me always to that question of, who am I in service to? Why do I do this work? And in yoga we have, and it's also kind of Buddhist teaching, where you're always thinking about 7 generations before you and 7 generations after you in terms of the intention and the work. So there's work that I might be doing in the present, but it is informed and held by my ancestors and on behalf of all that my ancestors have done for me. And then I am certainly thinking about, what do I want to leave for the generations that come after me? So the 7 generations framing for me is what is central to when I think about power, love, labor. I think what we've seen a lot in Antero, something you said earlier in the framing around why, being discouraged, like coming out of this and feeling like we're just going right back, because the intention and who folks were in service to was whiteness still. Like, we haven't disrupted, and I think you said this, we haven't disrupted how white supremacy informs all the work, the policies, the practices. As I said, I was reading Cicely Tyson this morning. She said, well, once white families, you can hear her just saying it, just because white communities, once they started suffering, now all of a sudden we have a problem. She was talking about the Great Depression. She was like, Black folks, we were always, struggling. But once white people started losing their minds, we had a depression. We had to name it something. And I think that's what we're going through again, right now. And so it's when you say I'm about Black lives, and when you say I'm about all of the other communities that are so often left out intentionally of the narrative, that's when the creativity and the ingenuity and the newness comes. But we're still working from a framework of wanting to maintain whiteness and white norms, what people consider the white norms. So I think that's how we can begin to shift differently about how we do our work and our labor, and certainly always with love. And at the core of that, self-love.
Always. Thank you, Marcelle. I feel like you get to, we didn't get so many questions, but you get to this idea that Laura was asking about, avoiding the pitfalls of suffering Olympics, right? I think this is,
oh yeah, I
think this is getting to that. And yeah, I'm grateful for your time. I think the chat seems very grateful for your time here. So one more time, please thank Dr. Marcelle Haddix for her time here.